That's a good question. You know, most of the diseases that pikas get are from things that suck their blood, ticks or fleas that are on the outside of their body. And so those bugs that live on the outside, like on their skin, mostly what might happen is if another pika comes close, the flea might jump over and jump onto the other pika and might die. So usually that's what happens. And most of the time, if a pika is sick, it might not survive. It might not survive having babies. It's true if it's really sick because it's just so energy intensive. But most of that disease stuff probably happens in the summer because they're up and about. They kind of stay in their own little territory in the winter, so it's a little bit more, less likely that they'd have any of those issues in the winter.
Jacob?
Do they kind of have like some type of bug spray?
Some type of bug spray. That's a good question. We don't really know. They do have nice thick fur. So just like a dog, if you've ever noticed your dog or your cat, mosquitoes kind of just are only on their nose and stuff because everywhere else on their body, it can't really penetrate their fur. So pikas are the same way. If you go to one of these pictures of a pika in the slideshow, they really don't have much of their body that doesn't have a lot of really thick fur on it. So they're pretty protected. Overall, it's not only bugs that could burrow into the fur and actually burrow down in there can get to them.
Is it possible for like a mosquito to bite or like get down in their ears and affect their ears or tip?
On their ears?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's actually the place we see the most. Mostly we see mites, which are little kind of tick-like things. We see a lot of mites in pikas' ears. And they often have those and they don't have any diseases. It's just every once in a while they might get a disease that way. But we do see a lot, the ears often have a ton of little things crawling in them.
Jacob?
Have you ever found a dead pika?
You know, I haven't. Most of the time, if something ate it, it drags it away, right, and pretty much eats the whole thing. If they die from some other reason, like a disease or cold, they die under the rocks. So we'd have to pull all their, they're underneath there and we don't see them. So I haven't ever seen a dead pika in real life.
Liesl, I heard you mention as far as their diet, they eat they collect the grasses and make the hay piles, and you refer to them as a diet generalist.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering,
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, with that being known, is it possible, because I feel like from what I've learned about them and what I've seen, their habitat is fairly specialized.
Yes.
So is it possible that you could say that they are a diet generalist but a habitat specialist?
That's exactly what we say. Very good, Jamie. That's great. Yeah, they are what we call habitat specialists. And some of what you guys might see when you're looking at all these different species that are in trouble or might be indicators, specialists tend to have more trouble in conservation issues, right? When either climate change or land use change or whatever it might be, if you specialize in something and that one thing goes away, it's a really big problem. So while pikas can eat a lot of different plants, they can only live in these talus habitats that are cool enough for them to live in. Just like I think you heard about sage grouse. Sage grouse can only live in sagebrush, right? And so if sagebrush disappears, they're in trouble. Same idea with the pika. And one interesting thing, though, we call them diet generalists. They actually are picky. They'll eat anything, but some things are better for them than others, and we've noticed that in some places pikas are disappearing because basically the buffet isn't as diverse and doesn't have as many options for them as another place. They tend to do really well in a place where there's lots of options for them to choose from, and so they can be kind of picky and pick out what they need for that day. Or at that time. And so you're totally right. They're habitat specialists and diet generalists.
Jacob?
So what would happen if the trees moved up to where they could?
That's a good question. So pikas, pikas can eat pine needles. You saw some pictures of a spruce twig in one of those hay pile pictures, but they really do a lot better. Their favorite foods are grasses and wildflowers. And so if tree line moves up, that's going to outcompete some of the other plants, right? Things like grasses and wildflowers usually don't grow in as tight or dense of groups if there are trees shading them. And so we do expect that to potentially affect pikas. The other thing happening with changing climate is grasses are taking over where there used to be more wildflowers. And grasses are really hard to eat. They have a lot of silica in them, which is a really rough material that protects the grass from too many things eating it. And so grasses have less nutrition too for pikas, and so we're a little bit concerned that as grasses move in, because grasses like it drier and hotter, they might outcompete wildflowers, and that could affect pikas too. They might not get the nutrition that they need to last through the winter.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions, Morgan?
Is it possible for pikas to grow under the roots of a tree if there are trees in the off-grid zone?
That's a good question. Yeah, we've actually seen there's some documentation of pikas living under downed logs too and putting their hay piles under that. And I have a friend in Japan who studies pikas, and they have these dwarf forests. They're really cool forests. And the roots are very kind of knobby and they stick up and they have holes under them. And they definitely make hay piles under the roots of the trees over there in Japan. Did you guys know the world's most famous pika? Pikachu. Pikachu is a pika. Think about it, Pikachu is a pika. Pikas live in Japan, they live all throughout Asia, and so Pikachu's the world's most famous pika. But he has a tail, which is totally wrong, right? But cartoons, what can you do?
James, was that your question?
Anyway, they like rocks best that they can live in those. There's also a pika over in Asia that makes burrows like prairie dogs, and they live in colonies. They're just like prairie dogs. They get along. They don't do the territorial yelling at each other thing. They actually live in colonies and family groups, and they burrow into the meadows just like prairie dogs. They don't have prairie dogs over in Asia. Most of all the ground squirrels like prairie dogs that we have here don't live in Asia, and pikas fill all of those niches, all those different things that animals do over there. And so we see that's why there are 28 pikas in the world and 26 of them live in Asia, whereas we only have 2 here in North America.
Austin, do you have a question?
No.
Miguel, do you have a question?
If you know how the fur is what keeps the pikas really warm so they can't take climate? Well, what if their fur wasn't as thick? Then could they survive warmer climate?
Yeah, that's a good question. Could they shed more like a dog does? That's a great question. It's really hard because overnight it still gets really cold in the alpine because all the air sinks and it can get really cold overnight even, and so it's a little bit tricky, and I've been up there, it snows in July and August, and so it's kind of hard, but I do think that's a potential adaptation they could have is maybe shedding more of their fur. All mammals shed their fur in spring and fall, but maybe they could shed more of it in the spring than they do. That's a good point. We'll see. We'll see how they change under these pressures.
Jacob?
So if they all live together like prairie dogs, why are they in a big field all together? Like a bunch of
over in
prairie dogs?
Asia, that one species that lives in Asia, they're in huge fields. They're actually on the Tibetan Plateau, which is a big flat plain, and it seems like a normal grassland, except it's about 18 or 19,000 feet because it's in Tibet, so it's really, really high. And that's one thing about pikas, is that they're really well adapted to high elevations. You know how if you have family or friends that come from sea level and come to Colorado, they have a hard time breathing. Pikas are really well adapted to being at high elevations. And similarly, those pikas over in Tibet, they live in these huge grasslands, but they live at like 19,000 feet. So they're able, they live in big prairie-like things, just like our prairie dogs, except much, much higher.
Okay, last question here.
So then are they hunted?
Are they what?
Hunted?
Hunted?
Oh, yeah, there's some, it's a lot like our prairie dogs. They make habitat for a lot of different species, just like our prairie dogs make habitat for about 30 other species that live in their burrows. It's very similar in Tibet, but also people trying to raise sheep and cattle and yaks and things sometimes worry about the pikas competing for food. So the Chinese government has tried to wipe out some of the pikas, and other people are saying the pikas shouldn't be killed, and it's actually a big old mess over the pikas over there, a lot like our prairie dogs here. They're very, very controversial.
Well, unfortunately, that is the bell right there. Class, what would you like to say to Dr. Piskel?
Thank you!
Thank you guys. Great to meet you through the screen.
Okay, get your
Have a
hands
great
ready for
day.
the power class.
Thanks so
Jacob,
much.
you're gonna lead it. Hands are ready.
1, 2, 3.
Nice. Okay, I'm gonna pass out your folders, and then you guys can put your sheets
You're
away,
welcome.
and then you're good to go. Please be
Pay
safe.
attention.